And when you looked, it was also related to the gear they were wearing, especially the life preservant vest and the seat angle, which most of them were used to the F-16 seat, which had a 30 degrees angle compared to the F-35 seat, which has a 18 degrees angle and has a much larger headrest compared to the F-16. And intervention, like we asked them, it said a lot of them went to do some sport and fitness, physical exercise, physiotherapy, and looking for medical support within the squadron, or trying to better fit their gear, which they were wearing, like the helmet, the MPU-20P, the life preservant vest, and maybe trying to adjust to the correct posture. So discussion, when we're looking at the results, the prevalence is high, but it's almost the same as we saw in previous studies. It does affect on performance and rest, but we have limited data about the F-35 pilots, only F-35 pilots. Back pain was mostly ejection seat angle related, and neck pain was mostly with the head seat and using the life preservant as it is. What we didn't expect is to see lower back complaints with the older population. Mutation, we had a very small group, and we had a lot of guest pilots that fly almost 20 hours a year, which also influenced our flight, and so maybe considering excluding part of this group for the next study. And we introduced some interventions in order to mitigate the effects. Can I have 1 minute? Okay. Yeah. So we introduced some interventions to limit this effect, like trying to get the low-profile life preserver, introduce lumbar support, human performance teams to help and work with the air crew to teach them, and we are now building a dedicated simulator for pilot gear fitting in order to fit them with the gear, put them in the cockpit, and see what effect it has on their performance and stress on their body. But those are interventions, and actually what we want is prevention. And the discussion that I had with different manufacturers, seat aircraft, there is no requirement regarding ergonomics of the pilot in the aircraft. And maybe it's time that we make it as important as letting the aircraft carry weaponry, because like our Air Force General said, airplanes are not made to make the life of pilots comfortable, and maybe it's time to change that. And that's it.
So if we have any questions from the audience, please come up and use the microphone here, introduce yourself, and then fire away.
While they're waiting, I have questions. That's the moderator's prerogative. I'm Bob Slater from South Carolina for the presentation. My questions were, first of all, in your conclusion you said maybe we should do some more physical therapy. What would that look like? What would the physical therapy training be, in your opinion? And secondly, the difference between the F-16 and the F-35, is it a G-force difference or just the seat angle? Two questions.
I think that the G-force is the same. I don't think, in general, they both reach 9 Gs. The only difference may be in the rate in which they reach the G-force. But looking at the air missions now, they are not very high G as in the past. They are much low G, 4, 5, 6 Gs, and not like going to the extreme for 9 Gs. So there, I don't see a lot of difference. And I think that the seat angle is more of the problem than Gs, but also the headrest. Because normally what we do, we teach them everything about the aircraft, but not teach them how to behave ergonomically in the aircraft. Because you'll figure it out, you're a pilot, but they don't. They use old habits that die hard, and then try to do the same in the new platform, what they did in the previous one, and I don't think it's good. We need to teach them some more.
So that would be the therapy part.
Yeah, we're not only the therapy part will be custom to the pilot, because every pilot is different, his needs are different, so this is why we have the human performance team which use, like they say, an homogenic approach, all the experts working together in order to give the best treatment to the community.
Great. Thank you.
Not a,
Thank you very much.
thank you very much.
Well, Peter's going to load up the second talk while I introduce it. The second talk will be presented by Rachel Cullen from the Medical College of Wisconsin. I'll disclose my bias. That's my home state, so yay for MedCal and other institutions. The differences in cervical and lumbar spine degeneration between fighter pilots, military helicopter pilots, and the civilian controls. So, Rachel.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. Again, my name is Rachel, and today I'm going to talk to you about a study that we're doing on military fighter pilots are exposed to high axial accelerations, typically denoted positive GZ, and working from head to foot as shown here. Pilots are also required to wear heavy head-borne equipment such as helmets, which weigh several pounds and increase the load on their neck. And pilots often find themselves in these non-neutral head positions. An example of this is a check 6 as shown here, which is a combination of axial rotation and extension. Another example of a military flight loading environment is that experienced by helicopter aircrew. During flight, helicopter aircrew are exposed to whole body vibrations, which is a low magnitude, high frequency load. They also wear quite a bit of gear, including helmets, night vision goggles, and quite a bit of gear on their vests. And they also adapt a position known as a helo hunch. This image here is a mid-sagittal lumbar MRI scan of a pilot seated in a neutral position and then on a helo hunch position. In the helo hunch, a pilot places his or her elbow onto their knee, resulting in this hunch or flex forward. And so we have these two extreme loading environments where we have these high accelerations in these non-neutral head positions and these whole body vibrations in this hunched posture. And so we can ask ourselves what might be the long-term consequences of experiencing this environment for hundreds of hours over the course of a career. To understand this, we've conducted MRI scans of both of these groups. We've scanned 18 fighter pilots, 16 males and 2 females. This figure here shows the career flight hours for this group of pilots. And we can see that the majority of flight hours for this group have been logged on 4th generation fighter jets, specifically the F-16. We also have scanned 15 helicopter aircrew, 13 pilots, and 2 crew chiefs who all fly the UH-60. This figure here shows the distribution of age for our 2 groups, and this figure shows the distribution of career flight hours. There are 2 things that I want to point out here. First, we have a really nice distribution for experience for both of our groups. We have pilots that are just beginning their career and have only been flying for a few years, and we have pilots that are nearing the end of their career and are on the verge of retirement. We also see a significant difference in career flight hours between our 2 groups. Both the fighter pilots and the helicopter aircrew are coming from the Wisconsin National Guard. However, while our helicopter aircrew are part-time, most of our fighter pilots are full-time and are flying a training schedule very similar to what an active duty squad would be flying. Then, like I said, all of these individuals participated in upright MRI scans of both the cervical and lumbar. Starting off with our cervical spine. So one of the things we looked at here was the health of the intervertebral disc. And you can look at this using the Fermat grade, where a grade of 1 is a relatively healthy disc and a grade of 5 is a severely degenerated disc. This figure shows the distribution for the number of degenerated cervical discs for helicopter aircrew in their 30s and their 40s, where a degenerated disc is any disc with a Fermat score greater than 2 or greater. And what we're seeing is that about 60% of our helicopter aircrew in their 30s have just 1 level of cervical disc degeneration. And then into their 40s, we now see 50% have 2 or more degenerated discs in their cervical spine. Similar findings for our civilians. Over 50% of our civilians in their 30s do not exhibit any disc degeneration. And then we have about 50% in their 40s who have 2 or more levels. For both of these groups, the helicopter aircrew and civilians, the most commonly degenerated disc is the C56. However, when we include fighter pilots into this, we are seeing more levels of cervical disc degeneration. For example, over 30% of our fighter pilots in their 30s have 3 or more levels of cervical disc degeneration. And we see this number increase into their 40s, where now over 70% of our fighter pilots have 3 or more levels of cervical disc degeneration, compared to about 15 and 30% in our helicopter aircrew and civilians. These additional levels of cervical disc degeneration are occurring in the upper cervical spine, so C2-3, 3-4, and 4-5. Again, this is kind of an abnormal location to be seeing this disc degeneration for this age range. We're finding similar things when we look at disc bulges. So all of our discs have been graded by a radiologist with either a grade of 1 for just a disc bulge, a grade of 2 being an annulus tear, and a grade of 3 being herniation. This figure shows the distribution of disc bulges across the cervical spine for both our fighter pilots and our helicopter pilots. For civilians, we would typically expect to see disc bulges occurring at C5-6, and for these two groups, we're not really seeing a big difference there. However, if I draw your attention to C3-4 and 4-5, we now see that 90% of our fighter pilots are exhibiting a disc bulge at these levels, compared to only 60% of our helicopter aircrew. Again, this is an abnormal location to be seeing more instances of these disc bulges in the spine. And I also want to point out that all of the fighter pilots in this study did have at least 2 disc bulges, and we had about half of them who exhibited a disc bulge at C3-4 down to C6-7. So why might we be seeing this? We're observing this abnormal upper cervical spine disc degeneration. Our hypothesis is that during flight, pilots are spending a lot of time in these non-neutral head positions, which often involve an axial rotation, as shown here in this check 6. When the cervical spine is rotated this way, we are now going to see pre-stress in the upper cervical spine tissues. And then while the pilot is in this position where we have this increase or this pre-stress in the upper cervical spine, they are now subjected to these high axial loads through these high accelerations, which may lead to increased tissue damage and therefore accelerated degeneration. This is important because some of our other work with these fighter pilots has shown that this cervical degeneration can be related to functional deficits. So another assessment that we do with the fighter pilots is before flight and immediately following flight, we measure their neck range of motion. And we've found that pilots with more cervical degeneration are exhibiting larger deficits in range of motion post-flight, which could be impacting their ability to maintain that constant situational awareness during flight. Moving on to the lumbar spine. So this is a similar plot to what I showed earlier, where we're looking at discs with that Furman grade of 2 or greater. What we're seeing is that for our fighter pilots, 40% of them are exhibiting 3 or more levels of lumbar disc degeneration. However, in our helicopter aircrew, we see 70% are exhibiting 3 or more levels. When we look at the lumbar spine, in civilians and in our fighter pilots, we're typically seeing degeneration occurring around L4-5 or L5-S1. However, these additional levels of degeneration that are occurring in helicopter aircrew are in this upper lumbar spine. We believe this may be connected to that helo hunch position. So all of our subjects in this study, since we're doing this upright MRI, are able to be imaged in both a neutral position and also their helo hunch. And we see that when pilots are in this helo hunch position, the anterior disc in the upper lumbar spine is significantly compressed. This additional compression, along with whole body vibrations, may contribute to tissue damage at these levels and then these additional degeneration in these discs. One other interesting finding from our lumbar spine has been a difference in prevalence of Schmorl's nodes. So a Schmorl's node is when the vertebral end plate fractures and the intervertebral disc is now able to enter into the vertebral body. This figure here shows the distribution of Schmorl's nodes for our fighter pilots in blue and our helicopter aircrew in green throughout the lumbar spine. And we're seeing that our helicopter aircrew have more Schmorl's nodes at each of the lumbar levels compared to our fighter pilots. We have helicopter aircrew who have 6 Schmorl's nodes in their spine, which is going to alter the normal biomechanics of the lumbar spine under these compressive whole body vibrations. The last thing I want to point out are some of the atypical shapes of these Schmorl's nodes. So these are 3 images from our helicopter aircrew. And what we would normally expect is looking at that top image on the superior of L2, we can see this Schmorl's node that has this very round shape to it. This would be kind of that normal Schmorl's node. However, we also can see, for example, in that same top image, on the superior of L1 and T12, we have these more jagged shapes. We have this rectangular shape. On the middle image, we also see this rectangular Schmorl's node. And then on the bottom image, on the superior of L2, we can see just a very massive Schmorl's node. We believe as well, or our hypothesis, is that these Schmorl's nodes are again coming from those whole body vibrations. So when your lumbar spine is subjected to these whole body vibrations, that cyclic loading on the discs is going to dehydrate your intervertebral discs. As your disc dehydrates, it's going to lose some of its ability to resist compressive loads, meaning that load has to go somewhere else. In this case, we think some of that load is being picked up by the vertebral end plates, which over hundreds of hours of a career from that consistent increased loading is causing the end plates to shift to have a higher bony composition, making them more brittle, so that when pilots experience something like a hard landing, these more brittle end plates are at a higher risk of fracture. So overall, we've seen these different patterns of spinal degeneration in fighter pilots and helicopter aircrew. We're seeing that our fighter pilots are exhibiting abnormal upper cervical spine degeneration, which may be connected to these high accelerations under these abnormal or these out of neutral head positions. And our helicopter aircrew are exhibiting abnormal upper lumbar spine degeneration, which may relate to these whole body vibrations in this helo hunch and then those occasional hard landings. Our future work, we're continuing to work with both of these groups, and it includes repeat MRIs on our fighter pilots. I would like to thank not only our team at MCW, but also at the Air Force Research Lab, the iPredict team, and the Wisconsin National Guard.
Thank you. Rachel, that was great. Thanks. Any questions from the audience? If not, I have one for you. Looking at this and one of the other papers presented in this section, the check 6 seems like just a bad idea physiologically because you're loading the C-spine so awkwardly. What do you think about training differences, perhaps using cameras instead of actual physically looking around? Thoughts on that?
Yeah, so my understanding is that there is a lot more of that technology in the F-35. These pilots all came from the F-16, where I think the check 6 was used quite frequently. I think it's kind of just that force of habit, and that's their best way to see the other aircrafts.
Question at the front.
Okay. Did you, in your lumbar spine patients, have any data on how many of them had symptoms? One of the things we struggle with in our active duty population is the high incidence of positive findings on MRI that don't correlate to clinical symptoms. So do you have any data on how many of those folks who had those positive findings, be it a bulge or otherwise, that actually had symptoms?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so we have a lot of pain questionnaires that we do with all of these subjects as well. We do have quite a few that have quite a bit of pain. But we do, like you said, have others that have these findings and it's not necessarily symptomatic. And so that is one of our goals of this study, is to get a better understanding as to where some of this pain might be coming from.
All right, Brian Funk, Sumter, South Carolina. Did you look solely at disc disease, or did you also look at facet disease?
Yes, so we've had a radiologist look at all of these scans. So we have quite a bit of facet degeneration in the lumbar spine, along with instances of foraminal stenosis.
And that was increased versus the controls too?
Yes.
Okay. And I will make just a quick comment about the check six. I mean, when you're in a defensive position in a fighter, particularly, fourth generation fighters, and I can't really speak to the future, but the sensors just aren't there, and you rely on the Mark I eyeball, and even if you have the Jahimics, it just adds more weight, and that's what you use to cue your weapons by looking at them. So you spend most of your time in a defensive BFM looking over your shoulder, and then of course, if the adversary reverses on you, you have to unload. And the pilots learn this early because it's self-critiquing if you don't unload and you try to turn your head at 9 Gs. And Dr. Shaw, who's here, published some of the early work on that, and they were actually seeing some fractures and things like that, like spinous process fractures when guys were first learning how to fly the F-16 versus the F-4 back in the day. But thank you.
That's
Nice
interesting.
presentation.
Thank you.
One more question as we switch.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your talk. Zach Carson. I'm the aerospace physiologist at Nellis Air Force Base. Kind of answered some of the questions or what ifs that I had from Dr. Funk there, but two things that came to mind is I kept seeing abnormal up there, and I may have missed it in what you said, abnormal compared to what? And then the thing that we like to do as physiologists is say, so what? So what do we do with this information when we're teaching our pilots? Because as Dr. Funk was alluding to, we have pilots that spend their time in those positions in defensive BFM. What are we supposed to do with that information? How do we take it to the pilots to decrease that potential risk when we're talking about actually executing the mission in those fighter jets?
Mm-hmm. Good question. So first with the abnormal, so for example, the fighter pilots have the abnormal upper cervical spine degeneration compared to what we see in civilians or helicopter aircrew. And then the helicopter aircrew have the abnormal upper lumbar spine degeneration compared to both our fighter pilots and civilians. As to what we can do with it, I think right now we're working to kind of dive deeper into this idea that some of this degeneration or this abnormal degeneration is linked to some of the positions that are used during flight. And if this is true, then it might be like things such as kind of your question was about, instead of getting into a check six, can we use the cameras on the outside of the jet to avoid that position? Or are we able to redesign the helicopter cockpit in a way that pilots aren't needing to hunch over for the entire flight?
Thank you.
Thanks.
Great. So next up we have Dr. Peter Lee from the Air Force Research Laboratory to talk about application of a coactivation index to evaluate complex movements of the neck.
Short, so I need to figure out where to put the mic appropriately. So hi everyone, thanks for being here. This is kind of building off some of the other work that was talked about earlier in a ways, but I need to look at how to measure as well as probably model how the experience in flight can be. So what we're trying to do here is look at how we look at muscle coordination of the neck in our aviators and what we can do with it eventually through the neck coactivation index. I'd also like to acknowledge my collaborators and co-authors, Dr. Reese Parr and Charles Weisenbach, for their contributions to this research. Quick disclaimer here. So the neck coactivation index provides a simple yet powerful way to look at how neck muscles work together during complex movements, especially with the added weight of helmets or other gear, such as the head-supported mass. This has major implications for improving helmet design, predicting fatigue on long missions, and creating personalized strategies to reduce neck pain, which is a significant problem for impacting mission readiness. Specifically, what we can do here is look at those improvements in ergonomics, quantify fatigue, and optimize those mission parameters, maybe from prehab all the way to cockpit adjustments, how do we use this capability to minimize neck pain and keep our pilots performing at their best? So as we also heard already, as neck pain is a pervasive issue amongst our military aviation population, often linked to factors such as high G maneuvers, awkward head positions, heavy helmets, and even cockpit design. So these factors combined with the demanding nature of physical and cognitive requirements of flying can magnify that risk for both acute and chronic neck injuries. So neck pain is commonly reported as nonspecific, making it really hard to pinpoint the causes and to develop those effective solutions when structural changes aren't always seen or unclear. But we need a different way or a more objective way to quantify the neck loading. So with the co-activation index here, it addresses this need by giving us a systems level of perspective of how the neck muscles work together. It quantifies the co-contraction of the agonist and antagonist muscles, the ones that move the neck as well as the ones that stabilize it, providing a more complete picture of this through a physiologic cost through different tasks and conditions. And this cost can be thought of the effort required to maintain stability and control. This index offers valuable insights in neuromuscular efficiency and endurance, the effectiveness of training, and how well potential head-supported mass configurations may work, and how the neck responds to the stresses of flight. This is where it's going to break, right? There you go. So let's take a quick look under the hood right here and how it's derived. So it's calculated using motion tracking of the head, muscle activity from EMG, and some general muscle morphometry, such as cross-sectional area and moment arm data. We put the EMG data on the trapezius, sternocleidomastoid, and cervical extensor muscles, essentially the muscles that we only have access to. And what we're trying to do here is we keep the math pretty simple and instead of having a deep model. And try to keep the minimal data for the derivation. And so the index or the approach was compared to the lumbar spine based model, and it seemed like it held up pretty well. But the index looks like what it does here is looking at the muscle surrounding C7T1 of the area of the neck, and it tells us what muscles are working to move the neck versus how to stabilize it. The index ranges from 0 to 1, with 0 meaning pure agonist-driven movement and 1 meaning full co-contraction, where agonist and antagonist systems are working hard together. So on the top right, you can see is like how the muscles are classified over an entire motion. And on the bottom right, you take that and boil it down into an index, so something that's more understandable. So while co-activation plays a crucial role in maintaining neck stability, especially during challenging conditions like high G maneuvers and non-neutral head positions, but insufficient or excessive co-activation can both be problematic. Too little co-activation compromises the intervertebral stability, increasing vulnerability to perturbations or response to those perturbations and potential injury. On the other hand, sustained high co-activation, while initially protective, can lead to accelerated muscle fatigue and increased spinal loads, also raising potential for injury risk. While the high G environments are a significant concern for aviator neck health, this particular study only focused on complex head movements under normal gravitational conditions. We're currently processing some data from our dynamic high G centrifuge exposures, so you can stay tuned for more in that area. But to our knowledge, this is the first study to evaluate co-activation with a helmet, adding a critical layer of realism to the understanding of aviator neck loading. So our primary aim here was to assess that co-activation index's potential for evaluating the neck muscle response in the presence of a head-supported mass. It's important to remember that the index assesses the body's response to the combined challenge of the head movements and the helmet, and not just the external load itself. So we specifically applied that index to evaluate that neuromuscular effort during a series of complex head maneuvers while performing a series of head maneuvers with the helmet. I want to start to say that this is, we need to understand the context of this study. This analysis was actually done as a part of a larger research effort investigating mental workload effects on the neck. But I decided to do a series of head motions beforehand to understand, say, what does this look like with the helmet, because it hasn't really been done before. For this part of the study, we've looked at a simulated helicopter seating environment with 62 subjects. Evenly split between men and women. They wore a 56P helmet, not a fighter pilot helmet, but it still allowed us to look at the effect of head-supported mass. We did flexion extension, axial rotations, lateral flexion, and check 6 maneuver, 2 of each of those, with kinematics and EMG. And then a one-way ANOVA was used to compare the PICO co-activation index between the movements. So our results here, you can see from left to right, from flexion extension through the lateral flexion, axial rotation, check 6, that the higher the complexity of it, the co-activation index ended up being more higher with that. So you can see the trend with this, where check 6 maneuver had the highest co-activation index, which kind of makes sense given what they had to do for that movement. But what's really interesting also with this is that the co-activation index with the helmet was higher than an independent data set, you can see in the dark blue, from a previous study. While I didn't have a check 6 maneuver in my previous work there, but you can see that the difference is there, that is comparable. So there's some face validity to, like, this should have more neuromuscular effort for that. Or the index should be as sensitive to those biomechanical demands. So overall, these results demonstrate that the index is a useful tool for understanding how the neck responds to movement or the head-supported mass. What this opens up is potential opportunities to leverage this to improve our pilot well-being. And yes, it sounds like I might be waving my hands in this in a ways, but it's like we need a way to take data from the environment and inform our physiologists, our care providers. It's like, what are they exposed to? Because just like we don't train a marathoner the same we train a sprinter, we need to understand those differences to be able to say what is the appropriate intervention that's needed here. Also, we need to think about, as better thresholds are defined, we can use this index to design better helmets and manage these pilot fatigue on these long missions. And even personalize some of these strategies for neck strengthening and prevent injuries. We're also excited for some of the future directions of this research. In pursuing there's different enhancements tied to this co-activation index, including work that we're doing with the Medical College of Wisconsin, with Dr. Stemper and Dr. Yoganandan, in which we're getting the MRI data to feed the model, to more personalize it, more population-based. And then also, we're going to use that with pulling data from inside centrifuge runs also, and to see what are they experiencing in G. So we have EMG inside the centrifuge and on our vibration platforms also. But further about this, we have is one additional piece to this that's neat is we're going to try to have no EMG in the system eventually. So where we're going with this is, can we use AI to build from the kinematics of the head, kinematics of the environment, to estimate what that neuromuscular load looks like? Because after all, we're not going to be able to get EMG into the aircraft. I know that. So being realistic here, what can we get from that? And how do we leverage AI for that? So overall, these provide valuable insights in muscular loading, and then their potential work that we can use this for, not just for this area, but to assess any task that requires your head and neck complex. Thank you.
So we've got time for one question from the audience.
Hi there, Bonnie Posselt, RAFCAM UK. Are you looking at long duration? You've spoken about neuromuscular responses to certain mission profiles, but what about increasing duration that we're seeing with mission sorties?
That is the goal eventually, to be able to sample that from flight. So right now, like, I'm trying to do surrogates where, like, can I pull stuff from the GEHEMIC systems? Mm-hmm. Because there's IMUs inside those helmets. So that's the goal eventually, is like, how do I extract this data? And right now, it's like the sampling of it, there's so much data, but how do I boil this down to effectively sample that data? That is the eventual goal of this work, though.
Super. We should make sure we link up. We're doing similar things.
Yes,
Great.
ma'am.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you again, Dr. Lee.
Right, and I'll just introduce the next one. But with that, as I do that, one quick question. Did you pay those subjects for EMG? That hurts, man, getting those needles jammed in your stomach. All right, paid. All right. And paper number 4, parachute opening, shock, and military tandem tethered bundle operations, presented by Tyler Brooks from Alabama.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. Switching gears a little bit from the aviation work to focusing on the effects of parachute opening shock during military tethered tandem bundles. Standard disclaimer slide, I have no financial relationships, and these opinions are my own. In terms of background, just changing gears a little bit here, the military freefall operations are used as a way to insert special forces military into operations in order to begin whatever their task might be. This is a necessary component for some of the future efforts, future military operations. The prior research looking at health hazard effects of paratroopers or working with airborne operations in general has largely focused on static line operations and understanding the issues from when you land, have a poor landing, or injuries through those. There's relatively little research, particularly in the military, trying to understand the effects of jumps and tandem bundle jumps. So this is a case where you might be trying to insert a large amount of equipment into wherever the operational start point is, and pushing a bundle out of the plane that you need to maintain control of. At the start of this project, there were some concerns that were raised looking at the effects of increasing the all-up weight or the total weight of the bundle as the design of a new parachute was coming online. And I mentioned, like I mentioned, really no prior research looking at this. The objective of our study, therefore, is to really try to quantify the musculoskeletal effects of increasing all-up weight in military tandem tethered bundle operations. And we also had some opportunity to compare this with normal freefall operations. High-level overview of the study design. Generally, this was a study where we enrolled and then followed subjects over the course of a training session. At the start, we were collecting demographics and performing baseline assessments of neck strength, neck range of motion, and shoulder range of motion. You can see these at the top of the charts here. And then during the week of training this data was collected under, we were capturing the kinematics from every jump. So we would instrument subjects who were going up using an inertial measurement unit system to capture body kinematics. This data was ultimately fed into a computational modeling software as well. However, that's not really the focus of today's talk. And then finally, at the end of the day, we were reassessing the strength and range of motion tasks, as well as capturing subjective measures of pain or fatigue. Our assessments, you can see here, pretty standard assessments for neck range of motion, looking at flexion, extension, left and right rotation, left and right bending. Same with neck strength, same orientations we were looking for. This is a manual muscle test task. All of our data collection was conducted in the field at the drop site. So some limitations potentially in the assessment methods as we're not using an isokinetic dynamometer. And then finally looking at shoulder range of motion. For this task, primarily internal and external rotation, just as a measure of is there any pain or any developing issues in the shoulders. For the inertial measurement capture for instrumentation, we're using a system called the OPAL IMU system. This is the equivalent of a sensor-based motion capture. So if you're familiar with Vicon or other types of motion capture systems, this would be a sensor-based alternative that allows us to capture whole body kinematics. It's a wirelessly linked system, so we can see what's going on in all of the different body regions. And the main reason we were looking at this one in particular is that it includes a barometer, so we're able to capture the descent rate, and if we lose the link between the devices through the current altitude, assuming none of the devices have fallen off or had any other problems, we're able to ensure that they're aligned in time. For this study, our primary focus was on the upper body. So you can see we had the red circles here indicating the locations of the sensors. We had one on the helmet, one on the chest, one on the abdomen, and then the upper and lower arms. For this study, I'm primarily reporting on just the measured peak accelerations from one of these sensors as opposed to the kinematic response of the whole body. In order to capture that data, we're looking at the head-mounted accelerometer as it was generally the cleanest data. The chest and abdomen typically had some interference from the parachute harness, so it was a little bit harder to capture clean quality opening shock and tether snatch. The two events here that are occurring is as the paratroopers exit the plane, when the bundle reaches the end of the tether, there is a jolt called a tether snatch event. So this is a first experience of some exposure, and then after free fall concludes, there's an opening shock event when the parachute actually fully inflates. Using some moving average windows, we're able to isolate these events and then also pull out the peak accelerations. These data are summarized through descriptive statistics, looking at the differences as you go through all-up weight and different jump conditions. The primary thing that we're looking for out of this is a definition of a hard opening, in which we defined as the 75th percentile of all opening shock events. So if you experienced a opening shock in the upper 25th percentile of the data, this would be identified as a hard opening within the data that we collected. For our statistical analyses, we looked at multiple levels, primarily for this presentation breaking down as the daily effect. So from baseline, was there a change at the end of the day as a result of whatever jumps were conducted during the day? And then an end of session effect, looking at from baseline at the beginning of the course, were there any effects at the end of the course, looking to understand what the accumulation of load may look like. I mentioned the jump severity. This would be the same as the hard openings. Really what we're looking for here is a count of if you had one or more hard openings in a day, this would highlight the day as a high load day. And then for the end of session, we're really just looking at the baseline versus end of course. For our volunteers population, this was 18 subjects, all male, Special Forces community, average age around 38, 40 years old, average of about 6 feet tall, about 210 pounds. We had a pretty good spread of the jumps over the past 12 months. So we have individuals who are jumping regularly but not a lot, and then also looking at individuals who are either instructors or test paratroopers who may have a significantly higher jump load over the course of the past 12 months. Similarly for their career, we also had volunteers who were jumping on the lower end, so these might be newer paratroopers who have just gotten their status as a tandem jumper, or individuals who have jumped in above 2,500 jumps in their career, so a pretty good spread. Within our data set, subjects completed jumps over an average of about 3.7 days, ranging from as few as 1 day of jumping and up to 7 days of jumping. The total number of jumps ranged from as few as 2 jumps over the session and up to 17 jumps with an average of about 8 jumps for each individual. As I mentioned at the start, this data was collected at the jump site, so it was all observational. We didn't really have any control over the jet test matrix, so ended up using some median splits of the data to see if there was an effect of the number of jumps and some other things along those lines. For our daily exposure, what I mentioned with the jump severity, subjects with at least one jump exceeding the 75th percentile of parachute opening shock, which was about 9.6 Gs, we did see an effect of in those populations, as well as subjects reporting on a scale of 1 to 10. So is this the best opening you've ever had as a scale of 1 versus the worst opening you've ever experienced as a scale of 10? The upper 75th percentile was about a 6 in this population, so if they reported a hard opening as well, we did see an effect there. Quickly to summarize those results, in both populations that we saw a significant reduction in the baseline adjusted strength. So these are the purple highlighted boxes here associated with the measured opening shock. Similarly, we saw an effect in the reported opening shock. There was some difference in terms of which directions we found the significance, but in general, we do see some changes in strength and range of motion, both for individuals who have a high load day. No changes, just down here at the bottom, we did not see any changes in shoulder range of motion associated with this data set. We also saw an effect in the reported pain. So after the jumps or at the end of the day, with the high load day for the measured opening shock as well as the reported opening shock, there was a relationship between the reported pain scale. This is in primarily the neck and shoulders here. I'll try to move through these, apologize pretty quickly. For the weekly exposures, we did see a significant reduction in neck strength. This is in the flexion, extension, left and right lateral directions. You can see highlighted there. We also saw a significant reduction in neck strength, range of motion first strength. However, it was in different directions. So there may be some effect of our sample size here that might be limiting what we can see in the data. There was no significant effect in this from the number of days jumped or in the number of jumps completed. This may be due to the limitation in our sample size as well. And then finally, we also saw a significant reduction in shoulder range of motion over the course of the week of jumping from baseline to the end of session. This was affected by the number of jumps, but it was only in the right shoulder. So again, this may be an effect of some of the statistics analysis that we were looking at. Wrapping up, primary takeaway here is that high daily jump severity, meaning one or more hard openings experienced, was associated with reductions in baseline adjusted strength and range of motion both, as well as we had reductions in physiological measures of strength and range of motion from the beginning of the week to the end of the week. These reductions are not necessarily indicative of an injury, but they may show that without recovery, there is the potential to develop some chronic issue or other problem going on. The limitations I've mentioned here, primarily the main one is the unbalanced data set. As an observational study, we had limitations on what we could control for the groups. We also don't have a great way of understanding what the non-jump effects are. So if they're carrying the parachute, typically the tandem parachutes are quite large, and they might cause some problems. And then wrapping up to at least to our knowledge, this is the first study or one of the first studies to really look at the musculoskeletal effects of parachute opening shock, specifically in a tandem tethered bundled operations, as well as the use of sensor-based motion capture systems in jump, so during the actual jumps. These data are intended to inform the development of a health hazard assessment for parachute opening shock. Through the development of new parachutes, we can use these types of data to help gear parachutes can't be exceed 10 G opening shock, so you can design that out of the parachute from the start, or alternatively you can inform the TTPs of the training program to say we're going to program in low load days after high load days. So if you have a day where you're expecting high opening shock, you can program a day where you have low opening shock or a classroom day after the fact. Thank you for the extra couple of minutes, and thank you for your time.
Again, if we have any questions, please come to the microphone. While we're waiting there, I have one of interest. Looking at the tandem and passenger jumps, were you measuring this just in the main parachutist or in the passenger as well?
Great question. Our primary focus was in the main parachutist. We did also instrument the passengers. That data set is quite a lot lower sample size. I think we only had 3 or 4 passengers jumped. The main rationale for that was a concern over essentially the opening shock is transferred through to the passenger, so there is a potential buildup of effect from that opening shock. We didn't see a large effect in them, and we didn't really have enough of a sample size to do much statistics on that population, but it was a component of what we were looking for. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Nice presentation, thanks. Did you, what was the opening altitude for the parachutes?
It varied. Generally, this was a standard halo jump, so I want to say 10 or 12, opening at 5 or 7. I can't remember specific numbers, but it was a standard halo, nothing special.
Okay.
Within our data set, we also looked at some more non-standard operations, but we didn't break them out in this analysis just due to small sample sizes.
Okay, so you didn't do any like high altitude analysis where you're going to get greater opening shock?
We have some data on that, and we did look at that, not as much as a focus of this. The data there is more focused on the kinematics of opening, and we do see some effect of the different altitudes if you're exiting high and opening high versus exiting high versus opening low. There are also some other concerns about just the general biomechanics of that exit of the plane. And we do have some data on that, but was a little out of scope and out of time for this presentation. But
Thanks.
Interesting problem, though. Yeah, thank you.
Before you go, I got one more question for you. I think you mentioned this, but perhaps you can amplify the point. Is there a direct correlation, therefore, a linear correlation between the number of jumps, as opposed to just the severity of shock, and loss of range of motion and strength, and therefore training guidelines? We're always running, what should we do with this data? So can you amplify that point?
Yeah, so we were looking for that in our statistics. We didn't have a breakdown of who jumped how much. So we ended up using a median split in our data of conducting more or less than 8 jumps. We did not see a statistically significant effect from that breakdown. My suspicion is that that's a sample size problem, not a fact that there's no effect. But we just need more data that we have a little bit more control over to understand. So thank you, good question. Thank you very much. I'm not done with everybody. No, I'm just kidding.
Great. So next up, we have Wing Commander Bonnie Posselt from the Royal Air Force Centre of Aerospace Medicine, who's going to be talking about progressive lens use in high-performance aircraft.
Thank you very much. It's actually going to be a dual presentation. I've got Colonel Scott McLennan, who's going to be joining me for a few slides. So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. I'm going to be talking about progressive lens use in the UK military, of which we represent all 3 services in the UK. And firstly, just to talk about words, is progressive lens the same? We use the same term for varifocal lenses. So progressive and varifocal lenses are interchangeable throughout this presentation, but I'll try and use progressive lenses, which is the kind of American terminology. Disclosure slide. So our background is that we have an increasing number of presbyopic aircrew in the UK military. Many of them use progressive lenses in all of their activities of daily living and then have to switch back to bifocal lenses to fly the aircraft. And this is becoming increasingly difficult, and pilots are asking us, why can't I fly with my progressive lenses? I don't like my bifocals. I don't like the harsh delineation between the 2 focal distances. And progressive lenses have been used for fixed wing and rotary aircraft, but they've not been allowed for fast jet aircraft up until now. And the question posed to us at the Centre of Aerospace Medicine is, can we safely allow progressive lenses to be used by fast jet pilots, and what is the evidence required to do so? So progressive lenses are transitional with increasing power on the inferior gaze, and there's no demarcation line between the top and the bottom focal distances. However, there may be some optical compromise in that corridor on the peripheral areas of the gradient in the middle. And some users do report visual illusions when they first use them, so they do require a period of adaptation when first used. They've been around for about 100 years, but it's been only fairly recently that modern lenses have greatly improved in terms of production quality and accessibility. So what evidence did we collect? So back in 2015, so quite a while ago now, our AvMed flight, we had dedicated Hawk aircraft that we flew some sorties with pilots, test pilots who are presbyopic, and they flew 2 different sorties twice. So the first sortie was a singleton profile designed to test performance during general handling and low-level flying, and a paired focus sortie which incorporated formation and air combat. And the test pilots flew that once with bifocals and again with progressive lenses. If they weren't used to progressive lenses, we gave them a 1-month adaptation period to get used to that, and mean age of 53 years there. So it was a small sample size. We had only 7 pilots fly this profile, but we found that progressive lenses were rated higher, and significantly so during defensive air combat maneuvers. And crucially, we identified that there were no adverse flight safety events using progressive lenses throughout this study. Going further, in 2018, we did a lens trial with bifocals and progressive lenses in a tornado simulator, which has a monochrome HUD. In the simulator, it's collimated to 12 meters, like a worst case scenario. Normally, they're collimated to infinity. And again, we found no significant issues with using progressive lenses. And again, the pilot reporting that they actually preferred them. I'm going to hand over now to Colonel McLennan, who's going to tell you about some more evidence that we collected on this area.
Thank you, Bonnie. I hope you don't mind if I adjust the microphone here. I'm kidding. No, thank you, Bonnie. It's honestly a true honor to present before you today, especially with my esteemed British colleague from the RAF. And please know I am wearing a U.S. uniform, but I'm representing the UK Army Air Corps. So all our opinions are UK-based, and of course, progressive or varifocal lenses are not approved in the U.S. military. So quickly, our Dutch colleagues, thank you for introducing it. We use a very similar electronic survey. It was called the MOD, Administrative Defense Analysis IHUB survey. Really simple design, but I thought it was really fruitful in the information that we got. And please note that varifocal or progressive lenses have been approved in the British Army Air Corps for about 10 years, so since back in 2014. So we have some good data and some good experience. Our pilots have been using this for over a decade, really without event. So it's been very safe technology to use in the aircraft. I ran this survey over about 5 months' time. I know that sounds a lot for only 12 pilots, but we want to make sure to give them ample time to answer the questions, especially with a lot of the holiday seasons and everything else that was coming up. The pilots mainly focused on 2 platforms that you can see, the Apache H64. Now we're using the Echo model over in the UK, as well as the Wildcat, as you can see in the bottom left. So again, we had a qualified response rate about 40%. The reason why I used 40%, about 12 of 30 estimated varifocal pilot were wearing varifocals in the British military, of the Army Air Corps. Now, this is the number of people that attested use of varifocal lenses from the medical center. There could have been more, like me, who are actively resisting using progressive lenses or bifocals because of my presbyopic gears are quickly coming upon me. Okay, so I want you guys to take a minute to digest this because it really hits home with what she just said. The pilots are wearing varifocal lenses in everything they do every single day and having to switch to the bifocal lenses when they get into the cockpit. And as you can see there, especially in the second set of bullets, that this was causing a lot of problems. So when I say they were having less frequency, is that they didn't have to really tilt their head as much with the varifocals, but the degree of tilt, they said they really noticed that the bifocals, they had to move their head up a lot more. As you can see, that could be some issues, obviously, flying the aircraft. And the other bullet that we were talking about, using these corrective flying spectacles, or CFSs, were causing a lot of issues. Very bulky with the helmet, and especially our Apache pilots using the loss of symbology with especially the new AAIHS in the new Apache 64 Echo model was causing some issues. You can imagine losing operational or situational awareness on your operational flight parameters as well as your weapon systems can be very problematic in the cockpit, especially for our Apache guys. I wanted to make a quick note, though, that there were still issues with the varifocal lenses. There's still a lot of peripheral distortion, but everyone to a T said the newer technology is getting better, especially in the last 10 years. They've been flying it for about 10 years. Before, the varifocals were trash. But now, they're noticing with the new technology that it's not as bad. The peripheral distortion was not too much of an issue. And I'll close by just highlighting one pilot that used both of these during his time in the cockpit. At first, he started with the bifocal lenses, and then within 10 flight hours, he said, I'm done. Just quit, and then started using the varifocal lenses without incident. So I can see there's a huge difference between the two, and it was nice to have one to be able to compare the two technologies. So really the results of this, and I'll turn it back over to Bonnie to talk about this, really changed policy in UK aviation, and I'll let her tell more about it here in the next couple of slides. So back to you, Bonnie.
Thank you. So some more evidence. More evidence is we actually happen to have a few fast jet pilots flying with varifocals, either on a waiver basis. We have literally a handful of senior flight instructors on Texan aircraft who we have waived to allow to wear progressive lenses. And we also had about 2 Typhoon pilots who had inadvertently been prescribed progressive lenses during a ground tour, and it got picked up when they returned to flying duties on their annual medical that they'd inadvertently been flying with non-approved progressive lenses. So we used that, and we sent them all questionnaires and surveys and asked for their experience. So Across these 7 fast-jet pilots with greater than 30 years collective experience flying with progressive lenses, we asked them what issues they've had, if any, and we identified no flight safety issues with all of these years of flying with progressive lenses in fast-jet platforms. The other evidence that we've heard is that they're successfully used in rotary wing and multi-engine platforms. Our colleagues, the German and Royal Canadian Air Forces, permit use. While the numbers are small, they have identified no flight safety issues or instances using them. That's not to say that they don't or won't exist, but we haven't identified any so far. So with this evidence that we've generated, so the Aircrew Visual Requirements Working Group, which is a small group of specialists based out of, which incorporates vision scientists, optometrists, ophthalmologists, and aviation or aerospace medicine specialists. We meet 3 to 4 times a year. We took this information to the Standing Committee of Aircrew Medical Standards. They considered it and approved it. That then goes to the Aircrew Medical Standards Steering Group, which is made up of pilots and duty holders who again accepted the recommendations of the SCAMs. That then gets written into policy, so it's in our Air Publication 1269 Alpha that progressive lenses are allowed for all aircrew in the UK military. There are some caveats. There is a 4-week adaptation period that is needed before they can fly wearing their progressive lenses, and they need a ground check and they need a non-safety critical roll check either in flight or in the simulator. And I'm not expecting you to read this, but if anyone wants more details, then you can come and ask me afterwards. So a ground check questionnaire asking to make sure that they have set the focal distance at the right level so that they can see everything that they need to see. So it may be that their progressive lenses for flying are different for their progressive lens prescription for activities of daily living. In fact, it's highly likely that they're going to be different prescriptions as to where that transition sits. And then we have the self-assessment questionnaire before they go flying for real. So time is up, so quick, just to summarize. Progressive lenses can optimize human performance that enable aircrew to fly longer and more safely. They offer aircrew increased personal choice. They don't have to fly with them, but if they do get on with them, then they can. And we have updated policy to reflect that improvement in manufacturing quality. It is a continued evaluation. We're working with our colleagues to continue to monitor any issues that could occur. And we do have to be mindful that at the moment, all our helmet-mounted displays have very small field of views for the symbology. The symbology often is skull-mounted, so it will move with your head, so no amount of head tilting. But as you increase the field of view in your helmet-mounted display, you've just got to make sure that your focal distance for near viewing isn't infringing on that display. And we are doing future research into multifocal contact lenses as well. Hopefully I'll be able to share that work with you going forward in the future. And just highlight the benefits of a dedicated tri-service multidisciplinary group to these areas of vision. Thank you very much for your time.
So again, any questions, please come up to the microphone. I'm just going to start off with one. So with the questionnaire, that's for the individual. Do they do it just the first time when they've got them before they go flying, or are there elements they do every time?
Thank you, Pete. Again, it's a work in progress. This is newly developed, so it's up to being changed. We're just bringing it in and educating our MAIMs, our military aeromedical examiners. But currently, your initial ground assessment is with your MAIM, with your doctor, and then after a 4-week period, it's a self-assessment yourself in either after flight in a non-safety critical role or in the simulator, before you're then cleared solo with your progressive lenses. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Nice presentation. I suspect that the old prohibitions were based on anecdotal data and opinions of the ophthalmologists back in the early days when Wilbur and Orville were flying or whatever. But question, so with the transitional lenses, for example, with the bifocals, they can mark a grease pencil line and how high they want the segment and things like, and whether they want executive or not bifocals. With the transitional lenses, can the pilots designate where they want the transition zones?
Correct. So we empower the aircrew who know their working environment inside out to have those frank discussions with their optometrist about what they need to be able to do to set that transitional zone. And if it's not right, that's why we have these checks, because if it's not right, when they actually try it in the cockpit, then we have to go back to the drawing board and reset that transition point.
Good. And I mean, your study seems to show that that it's safe to use them. Has anybody looked at performance, for example, say aerial gunnery accuracy by reviewing HUD tapes? I mean, back when these rules were placed, in fact, they just had a early gun director sight or a LCOS, and now we have enhanced gun sights that are much more accurate. Is there a difference between somebody wearing a bifocal or somebody that is wearing progressive? And is there a difference between the guy who wears the bifocal flying but wore the transitional in his daily life versus the guy who always wears that one, both for daily life and flying, in terms of their aerial gunnery performance and things like that?
So I don't have exact data on that specific scenario.
Might be a good feature
but bifocals, you have this really hard demarcation line that obscures your view right in the middle of your field of view. So you have to move your head much more to get over that demarcation line. So in the simulation studies that we did, we noticed that people weren't moving their heads quite so markedly over that area. That may translate to a specific use of the gunnery. What you need to make sure is that all your distance vision tasks need to be in your distant vision prescription. So that's the important part. The near vision area should be pretty small because you should only need it for seeing inside the cockpit.
Correct, yeah.
Yeah.
One more question behind you. Quick question.
Sorry. Thank you.
Quick question. Last one.
Thank you. Lovely presentation. I'm Thijs from the Netherlands, Royal Netherlands Navy. You have me lingering with this question, how much data do we need to actually succeed in changing policy, right? And we struggle with this a lot with new emerging medication. And so basically, the question is more critical than the meaning to, because I think you're doing lovely work. If I'm a policymaker with a negative point of view, I'd say it's just 7 or a limited amount of patients. So how much do we actually need to change policy safely? Because in advance it would seem that it wouldn't be a real danger, right? You have some field testing, and now you've included 7, perhaps 10 or 20, I don't know. But to be fair, how much do we really need? If tomorrow an accident happens and he happens to wear progressive lenses.
But so I completely agree with you. I mean, that's a big philosophical question, right? Would 100 people satisfy you? Would 200? So, but I'm not saying that they don't have flight safety issues. They could, but the not having evidence doesn't mean it doesn't exist. All we can do is, what we've shown so far is that we have not identified any flight safety issues, and the pilots are pushing for this as well. They want better choice. They don't want to switch between, they use them, they prefer them, they use them for all their activities of daily living. And we have a population that we have increasing numbers using them. So how do we do it safely? We do it safely by making sure that I'm not just going to say, okay, we've changed the policy, that's it, I'm never going to look at it again. We make sure we track it. We make sure we talk with our international partners who are also using progressive lenses, and to identify if there are any safety occurrence reports, then we track them and we share them. We also try and build in a 1-month adaptation period. We build in that need for a ground assessment to make sure that you can see everything that you need, and we do a non-flight safety critical flight check or sim check to ensure that you can actually do what you need to do with them. And I think that's as much as you can do. And then you need to take a risk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great job.
All right, thank you.
And as Peter loads up the last one of this session, I'll introduce it. This is from Joan Seri from Toronto, Canada. Neurological biomarker profiles indicate early neurodegenerative processes in high-performance aviators. The results from the Canadian WMH study. So, thanks, Joan.
Thank you. Thank you for staying till the end to hear this talk. I hope it's exciting. It's a large team that we have. I don't have time to thank them all, but at least 3 or 4 labs working on this project. The requisite disclosure is that there's no disclosure, although I do have an acknowledgement for the funding. By way of background, this study dates, or the inception of this body of work dates back to Maguire's early findings of subtle neural deficits in the U2 pilots and a NATO working group that was stood up as a result of that. But this study is ongoing subsequent to that with new and emerging work. So talking about the Canadian white matter study specifically, we aim to first look at the prevalence of white matter. That was sort of the starting point. And you've maybe heard me give multiple talks. We're in a sequence of probably about talk number 5 on the results of this large study. We also wanted to identify exposures and do a variety of things. Today I want to talk to you about some of the learning we're having in trying to better understand the pathobiological basis of what's happening in these white matter findings in fighter pilot brains. It leads us to think about the stressors of flight, because the original inception of the work was a presumption that the challenges were related to hypobaria. But now we begin to think about whether or not there are a variety of other stressors of flight that could be playing into this. And clearly there are a lot. And every time I present this slide, I think of another one. And I just heard one about, shear stresses today and vibration. Maybe that plays into it at all. But we are hypothesizing that there's some dysfunctional central or peripheral immunoinflammatory activation going on and resulting in microstructural white matter damage. So what did we do in the study? The overall study was a 2-day study where we gathered a mountain of information, not all of which I'm going to talk about today. And you can see it there, and I'm really going to focus on some of the peripheral biomarker work. And to review that, I'm not going to go into a big lesson in biomarkers, but suffice it to say that if there's brain trauma, it will induce activation of innate immunity in the brain tissue and in the CNS, resident immune cells and microglia, which will be the sort of first responders to the brain insult. So upon injury then, you're going to get cytokines and chemokines released. You've heard this story before about all the cascading releases that can attract peripheral immune cells, and some of those will be able to cross the blood-brain barrier. And then there can be additional releases, and that can itself cause ongoing problems. This is not my proposal. This is a fact, and I'm just giving you the background for to feel comfortable in understanding the results of the study. So there are quite a lot of biomarkers, again, not all of which we looked at, many of which we looked at in a prior study. I'll refresh your memory on that as well. But suffice it to say that biomarkers can indicate a variety of things: neuronal cell body damage, oxidative stress, ischemia, chronic neurodegeneration, a variety of things. And this is a nicer picture of some of the different biomarkers that can be related to different pathophysiologic processes. So we have, that slide got modified a bit. Apologies for the way those numbers look on this format. But hypothesized mechanisms of injury in aviators, there's a variety of things. So it could be hypobaric stress and decompression, and that may be because of microvascular damage, blood-brain barrier compromise. Why would hypoxia or hyperoxia cause a problem? Maybe it's oxidative stress. Maybe it's mitochondrial dysfunction. G-force, maybe it relates to perfusion changes or axonal strain. or a pro-inflammatory cytokine cascade release. Anyway, now this is not the results of this study. This is the prior study that I presented in 2023, but it sets the stage because here we started looking at the immunoinflammatory response and our first set of profiling. And what we did there was we looked at 50 inflammatory biomarkers. We quantified a large number of them. The list of them is there. I'm not going to go through them. That's a huge list. And we looked at them en masse with latent modeling. And what we found was that this model, we were able to identify with 100% accuracy the distinction between pilot and non-pilot aircrew with using this whole entire basket together in a latent model. And so at that point, we had presented that higher plasma levels of inflammatory mediators compared to controls and a distinct profile of peripheral immunoinflammatory biomarkers expression and reactivity, suggesting a link between exposure. And I already mentioned we can distinguish fighter pilots from non-pilot aircrew 100% of the time with that. So now here we go. What about the objectives for this study segment? Same objective, we wanted to look at neurologic injury markers, not the same biomarkers from the 2023 analysis, and we selected specific ones looking to identify glial activation, axonal damage, oxidative stress, neurodegeneration. And we wanted to compare this to an unexposed set of controls in the Canadian Forces, so they are also military members. Here's the way the study looks. We had 48 CAF aircrew with flight exposure. We had 48 non-aviator CAF controls. The blood was collected peripherally. I don't need to tell you that. The biomarkers, the 8 biomarkers are listed there. I'll show you them in great detail momentarily. And these neuroproteomic biomarkers were selected on the basis of the brain specificity and the potential to reflect a pathoanatomical injury mechanism. So that's why we picked those. And here it is. Here are the results. So each dot representing the biomarker concentration for a specific individual subject. The solid lines are showing the median. And the significant differences at p less than 0.5 are Mann-Whitney U. You don't need to worry too much about that. But look at the green highlighted areas in particular, and look at the pattern in particular as well. So the pattern is consistent, and the main summary of the finding is that aviators exhibit significant elevation in biomarkers that indicate axonal damage, astrocyte activation, and oxidative stress. And those are the 3 biomarkers that are indicated there. Tau levels were modestly higher in aviators. That suggests a potential for early neurodegenerative process. We're not sure. We'd like to look at that more. And then we have trends in the same direction, but not statistically significant in the other 2 biomarkers that we looked at, suggesting subclinical blood-brain barrier, neuronal stress, and injury. So we think this is the first time that there's been evidence of these elevation in military aviators, and these type of biomarkers suggest that there may be flight-related stressors leading to glial activation, oxidative stress. We don't know about cumulative neurologic damage or dysfunction from repeated exposure, but it could have implications. And while the other biomarkers showed non-significant trends, if we had a larger sample size, we don't know what we would find. So what are the implications? Is there a risk for long-term neurologic injury, for cognitive decline and tauopathy? This is not the kind of thing we see regularly in these individuals, I don't think. However, what I don't have access to at this point is the actual claims data for how often it happens in aging pilots. However, it is also it's a difficult population to work with because, of course, I jokingly say you can shave 10% off the IQ of a pilot and they'll still look better than most of us. So it's hard to actually identify some of these changes. There could be subclinical damage, and early detection with biomarker monitoring could be of value. So let me skip this slide and move on to what our future directions are. We'd like to expand the sample size. We'd like to do some longitudinal follow-up. We'd like to incorporate cognitive assessments, which we do actually have the data, and we do plan to present, and we do plan to do a journal supplement to Frontiers in Physiology. So if there's anyone in the room doing this kind of work that would like to actually contribute to a supplement in Frontiers in Physiology, please speak to me afterwards. And preventive strategies as well for risk. And we're starting to look at some novel neuroprotectants, including off-label use of certain medications that we think have neuroprotective capability. So we think that there needs to be ongoing monitoring and research. We think there may be a potential for personalized protocols for stress management and evaluation. And if you're interested in this in any more detail, you can read this article, which will tell you a little bit more about those biomarkers. And I'll end it there. Step aside for questions. Hopefully the timing was good. I guess we're done. Yeah? Thanks. Okay.
So any questions from the audience? Come on forward to the microphone, and I have a couple. Joan's very interesting. So do you think that the changes that you're seeing are due to radiation at higher altitude or G-forces or some other reason? What's your speculation on that?
Yeah, it's interesting because remember when I said, I keep adding things to the slide for causes, and I did think about radiation, but one thing that I think, to be honest, is I think there's a final common pathway for a variety of stressors. So it could be actually subclinical, very low-grade, chronic, maybe not a massive trauma, but repeated kind of subclinical micro events. I'm not sure, to be honest, but we continue to look at and consider a variety of things. We're quite interested in G, actually, to be honest. And one of the things we're looking at when we did imaging with this study as well is the location of the white matter in the brain. And we've done a regional volumetrics to look at that and see whether or not we think it relates to, and interestingly, occipital lobe is of interest. And it's like, what happens in the occipital lobe and when you're moving forward and your head is moving forward and back? Anyway, so maybe.
Maybrit Kuipers, European Space Agency. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation, and I think it's a very important topic. So I'm very happy to see that you're really digging into this. Actually, I had the same question as that was asked, but as a kind of follow-up to that, since your main focus was on fighter pilots, and to get a better differentiation, like what is the main stressor, or is it all of the above? Maybe a suggestion to look not just in fighter pilots, but also like a broader pilot community. Maybe even civil aviation, because they may not have the extreme stressors like the G-forces that we typically see in fighter pilots. So it could be interesting to kind of compare within the aviation community what is happening. That's just a suggestion. Longitudinal follow-up, you mentioned that in your last slide. I think that's hugely important. I don't know what it's like in Canada or with the other air forces, but I know that in some air forces the follow-up stops once they retire from the Air Force. And so how is your approach on that?
So the longitudinal follow-up would have to be while they are engaged still, right? The question is whether or not we need to start at a baseline and what that baseline would be. Can we catch them early? Can we watch them over the course of time during training, towards the end, at transitions? Not sure. And we haven't got that far yet. We don't have funding for a longitudinal study at this point. But I wanted to pick up on something what you said about commercial pilots that are non-military pilots, and I have recently just seen a study literally published, I just found it within weeks ago, that is a study before and after exposure to jet fuels, I think. So, or not jet fuels, commercial aviation fuels, and looking at changes in biomarker before and after fuel exposure. It's published in the occupational medicine literature, looking at some of these biomarkers, and they also are starting to show changes in that literature as well. I'm not super familiar with it. I was surprised to see it, but it'll certainly be interesting to start looking at other literatures in non-fighter related exposures are also starting to show biomarker changes in the world of aviation.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
One more question.
Dr. Siri, that was incredible. This is Smith Johnston.
Thank you, Smith Johnston.
Department of Aerospace Medicine, Central Florida University, retired NASA. We heard some incredible stories, not stories, but data from our hyperbaric folks. And I'm wondering, shouldn't we be treating these folks in the future with hyperbaric therapies?
You know, it's interesting you say that, having just seen a lecture this morning about that and taking notes and thinking about that in terms of, well, first of all, the number of populations we know that have parallel results to this. It's not as though it's just shown in the fighter pilots, right? We see it in chamber operators, we see it in divers, we see it in caisson workers, we see it in high altitude Sherpa hiker kind of people. Like there are a lot of other populations that have parallel finding to this, and the question is, you know, a radiologist, if you see a radiologist report, it says scattered white matter, hyperintensities of no clinical significance is what you will see. So it was a long time before people thought it was even relevant at all. So treating it that's very interesting. Our next paper is going to say, okay, do you need to treat something? I think this goes with Tesa's question about, well, how much, what's your decision about what action to take? And do you want to treat something when we got no proof it's correlated with the long term? We're speculating, right? But we will be looking at, and I'll tell you the study we're looking at metformin as a start because we've seen changes in the water content of myelin, and we can do imaging to look at that through fMRI. So we're looking at off-label use. But I do think after today and after some of the stuff we've learned related to hyperbarics, although I will say in people that have had, you know, DCS, they probably be part of the population anyway. That may be something to think about, but I don't know. Food for thought as usual. Okay.
Okay, that brings an end to what I think has been an excellent session. Thank you for joining us. If we just thank all of the speakers again and let you on with your afternoon. Thank you.